Frontline workers keep our world moving. They work in high-stakes, fast-changing environments where technology can empower them or hold them back. And when adoption fails, the impact ripples outward, slowing teams, frustrating customers, and undermining the success of the entire organization. This is Frontline Innovators, and I'm your host, Justin Lake. In each episode, I speak with leaders who are rethinking how technology is introduced, embraced, and sustained on the front line. Leaders putting people at the heart of digital transformation. Frontline Innovators is brought to you by Skillful. We help organizations achieve lasting technology adoption for frontline teams so they can work smarter, safer, and with confidence in the tools they use every day. Welcome to the Frontline Innovators podcast. I'm your host, Justin Lake, and super excited about today's episode. Today's guest is an operating executive and enterprise operational excellence consultant who helps organizations improve supply chain performance, ERP implementations, and operational excellence. Throughout his career, he's worked at the intersection of technology, business transformation, and the people responsible for making change successful on the front lines. He's joining us today to share his perspective on what it really takes to drive lasting operational change. Please welcome to the show, Torrence Smith. Hello, sir. How are you today?
Fantastic. How are you doing, Justin?
I'm well, and I'm super excited for our conversation today. And we're going to get started, as we've talked about, with getting your take on what you think is the biggest operational consequence of poor technology adoption on the front lines. How would you position that from a business impact standpoint?
Yeah, I think there's actually more than one, even though kind of depending who you talk to, they'll focus on one of three. As far as the people involved in the enterprise, I think there's a huge hit you take as far as credibility when the adoption goes badly. We assume that we have all this trust in the workforce, and the truth is, almost like a politician, it ebbs and flows. You make a good decision that has, high positive impact and it goes up. And maybe you make a bad decision or you made a great decision, but didn't execute well and it goes down. I mean, that's just kind of the reality, human nature. On a business standpoint, you probably said, up during this year, we're going to do a transformation and it's going to be great. And then we're going to have all these benefits. And the reality is, with the poor adoption, you might actually go backwards. And then, of course, last but not least, there's a financial impact, right? So, especially you mentioned in the introduction, things like, ERP implementations. Those are a prime example where you could spend, hundreds of millions of dollars and actually end up worse off than you were when you started.
Let's go. Yes, I agree with that. And I want to come back to that piece on the ERP implementation and ending up worse. But I also want to go back to your first answer, which is really about losing credibility in the organization. Because I do see this happening often, and I'm curious to hear how you think that actually plays itself out. Like, okay, so leadership team lost a few credibility points, but so what? How does that actually impact the organization?
So the next time that you show up with an initiative, they're less likely to be enthusiastic. I think any one of us who's involved in transformation, change management, we're used to showing up someplace and having the operators say, or middle managers say, yeah, the last implementation didn't go well, so we don't have a lot of hope for this one. Now, it could have been a completely different management team. It could have been a completely different, project leader, but nevertheless, in their minds, they're equivalent. So the best way to, have a successful implementation is to succeed in the implementation that happened before it. Some of which you can't control, right? If there's been a management changeover, or whatever. So, but yeah, they have a long memory. And some have seen even, leadership change because of, failed implementations. So then, especially say a middle manager, they're wondering if by supporting what you want to do, is it going to cost them their career?
I think that's a really interesting point about the success of this implementation, whatever it is we're working on now, being impacted by the last implementation. I think that's a perfect statement. That's very accurate. And yet you're right. The people that are involved in this program may not have been the same people that were involved in that last program, but we still have to carry the baggage from those previous experiences. It kind of affects the culture around the teams that are going to be impacted by this change. So what would your advice be to kind of overcome having some of that baggage on a project today because of things that happened in quarters and years past? How would you advise that we overcome that?
Probably there's three things that come to mind. The first one being, as you're building a project, you don't want the change management part, which is involving the people. Don't save that for the end. You could save yourself a lot of suffering by having kind of like a people-centered change management plan. In other words, you involve them from the beginning in the design of what you're hoping to do. And you kind of give them the broad outlines, like here's the things that we're trying to accomplish, here's the problems that we're trying to solve. And so as you bring them along, as you're building the plan and they're giving their input into the plan, now they have ownership. So it's not, here's this thing that management is doing to us. It's, here's this thing that we're doing together. And so I think that goes a long way. The other is when you show up with your bright, shiny idea, right, which you got wherever you got it, right? It came from senior management, you read it in a book, you completed a course, and now you're like, this is what we need to do. Probably a good idea to just ask them, what have you already tried? And then just get it out of their system. Let them tell you about all the initiatives, which ones went well, which ones failed, which ones didn't fail, but didn't necessarily succeed. Because I think we make the mistake of showing up and just talking about today as if it's a blank sheet of paper. And the reality is, it's not. And the longer an organization has been around, then the more organizational memory you're going to have to deal with.
That's a great term, the organizational memory. And I had this play out in an experience this week. I was on site with a client, and I won't share details about the client because I certainly wouldn't want them to think that I'm talking of the story in any negative way. But there was a bit of a healthy debate even amongst the team where their project has been kicked out by about a quarter from the original plan, which is actually not too bad. There's some concern it may get kicked out a little bit further. And then some debate ensued about when the change management communication plan should begin for the majority of people who are going to be affected by this. And the debate was, one faction was saying, no, let's just wait. The application's far down the road. We're having delays. We really don't have time to deal with that now. And the other side was saying, years ago when we implemented SAP, that's the approach that we took. And we all know how well that went, right? With a little bit of sarcasm.
Mm-hmm.
And so to the point you're making, it hadn't even gotten to the organizational memory of the frontline team members that were impacted last time. But this was a stakeholder who was sitting in the planning room who was saying, let's not forget that last time we tried to do it that way and it didn't work so well. And so how can we learn from those lessons, learn the lessons that we should have learned from last time and change the trajectory today? And what he was advocating for was actually still starting sooner rather than later, even though the implementation, the go live date has been pushed out to the right by several months at this point.
Yes.
But let's not waste the time that we have now beginning that communication. And so, I was actually becoming a bit of a bystander to this conversation. It was their company. It was two stakeholders, inside their company. And so I just, kind of sat back and let them talk through that a little bit. But it is interesting, and I see both sides of it. The person who is advocating for delaying is the project manager, who's on some level, his hair is on fire right now, trying to keep all of the other scaffolding of this project in place right now. And so dealing with something that feels like it's so far out, feels like it's something that can be kicked down the road a little bit, you know. But this other person who's not involved in the scaffolding of the project is just thinking about the impact of the operations, the impact of the field. In this case, it's a bunch of field service technicians and delivery guys in the field that are going to be ultimately impacted by this change. And so he's saying, let's get this thing started absolutely as soon as we can, so that go live becomes a non-event, right? Instead of
Yes.
making it this like
Yes.
big cliff thing. What are your thoughts on that?
So
That had it. You gave me a
yeah.
big response to that statement, so I want to hear what you're thinking about.
So this is the only Japanese term I'm going to throw at you during this conversation. I
Okay.
promise. I mostly promise. It's
Okay.
called Nemawashi,
Okay.
which is, I don't know if you've heard it. Like
I
all the
have not.
Japanese companies, so Sony, Toyota, all those companies understand this idea of the meeting before the meeting. So literally, it means preparing a tree, I think, for planting, where you wrap up the roots and you prepare the soil and you do all these things to make sure that when you plant the tree, it will grow. But in Japanese industry, it essentially means having a series of kind of low stakes conversations, right? So it's not just progressive versus big bang project. It's also progressive versus big bang conversations. So you really have a choice of either we do some Nemawashi, where we're having these low level meetings with decision makers, machine operators, field service technicians, middle managers, dispatchers, all those people. We're having low stakes conversations. It might not even be in a conference room. We're talking to them, we're getting their input, we're kind of going back and forth. And then when we get to the conference room where we're having the formal discussion, the conversation kind of changes from what is the current situation to what are we going to do about the current situation. And it seems like nuance, but it's actually a really big thing, because what you're hoping to do is build consensus. So the manager that wanted to hold off, he's probably kind of thinking in terms of control, right? If people find out that there's problems, then they'll lose confidence in the project. But if they were involved in developing the project, then they'll want to know what the real status is. And if you've done a good job of designing the project, then they have something at stake in its success. So I know we talk on the podcast about like resistors, people who, hear about the project and push back against the project. The time to dissolve that is right at the start. And so you want to get all that negative. It seems counterintuitive, but you want to get all of that out in the open, have honest conversations, and when their concerns are true, address them before you're in the thick of things, or you quote unquote implemented, right? You've gone live, the system is on, but people are doing workarounds, right? Or it's live, it's in the field, but it's not actually delivering the value that you thought it would. And it's because of decisions that you made all the way back at the beginning. It's almost like screenwriting, right? I'm not a screenwriter, but they say that if you have a problem in the third act, it's because of something you did wrong in the first act.
It makes perfect sense.
It's the same thing.
Yeah. Well, I think the other thing about what you just said that I believe and agree with you on is about sharing and letting them become part of both the problem and the solution.
Yes.
And I think you might be onto something. I don't know The gentleman that I just met this week, I don't know him in particular well enough to know yet about that, but I've seen other people in his role, and they have a very legitimate source of stress on their mind right now. They're frustrated about, again, all the building blocks of this project, and things are delayed, and maybe the vendor's not performing, and all the other things that go wrong, in the kind of back half of the build phase of a project. So it's very ordinary to feel those concerns. I think what for some reason seems counterintuitive, as you called out, is getting the people that are going to be affected by this involved sooner rather than later. And I think one of the things that maybe is human
Yes.
nature across the board is like the things that we don't know about actually cause more fear and anxiety than things that we know about. And so when the team knows that we're
Yes.
changing our ERP, or we're changing our field service management software, or there's new warehouse management software coming in, they know these changes are happening because they were announced at some big executive level, meeting or an all hands call or something like that. They know it's hanging out. There's just like black cloud hanging over their back. And now they're not hearing anything. Now they don't know why it's delayed. Now they don't know what's going on. It feels to me, or not feels, I've witnessed the stress rising over time.
Yes.
And I can't be certain that it's because of that, but I certainly don't think that that's helping when we keep them out of the loop. And so I actually think your point is a perfect one, which is the sooner we can involve them in that and be part of the solution, it's actually the better. I thought you were going to say something else about the Japanese with the preparation of the root ball on the tree, because I think it's also an old, Japanese proverb. I don't know if I just saw this as a social media meme, but like the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is now. I kind of feel like that comes into this discussion as well. Like the sooner we can start communicating, the better. Any day, any week, month, quarter that we're dragging our feet and saying, well, let's do that later, we're
Yes.
probably losing an opportunity to improve our outcomes down the road.
Yeah, I agree. And so the cost of mistakes is low in the beginning, right? So maybe it's just Torrance and Justin talking in a conference room saying, "Hey, I've got this idea. Here's what I think can improve the business." It's very low stakes. Uh, when you have already paid for design, already engaged a third party vendor, already have consultants running around, already engaged, senior management, executive team, and they've signed up to this, your burn rate goes up, right? So it could be millions of dollars a month, depending on what it is. And then obviously the potential credibility impact goes up too.
Yes.
Yeah. So why would you wait until later? Just imagine, so we put in a solution when I was at Mitsubishi Caterpillar called One Call, and it took our OEM, which was us, connected us to 90 separate independently owned dealerships in 400 locations. And we were all servicing Home Depot, which was our largest client. I don't think that's a secret.
Yeah.
So Home Depot looked at all of us as being a single company, even though we were 91 separate companies. And I just imagine if when we turned on One Call, if our independent dealers went to check in at Home Depot using the platform and it didn't work, the blowback from 90 separate companies, independently owned companies, would probably be very high. Fortunately, we'd involved them from the beginning. So, the functional requirements and the technical requirements, a lot of that came from field service technicians, dispatchers, independent dealership owners. It wasn't just our team. So it was a progressive gathering of requirements. And then we told them, where the program was as far as progress was. And then instead of doing a big bang and launching it to everybody at the same time, we launched it at a local dealership and made sure the whole system worked. So they got the benefit of, that solution without kind of any of the downside, of, dealing with bugs, technical issues, etc.
Do you mean local to the project team? It was one of your dealers that was close to
one
where
of our
you guys
dealers
were.
that was located in Houston. So then that way, hey, we could just run over there and see what's going on.
Yep. Proximity matters with those types of things, right? It just closes the physical gap a little bit. So that's great. What's something that you learned in that process, in that early phase? Like there had to be something that was discovered in that process that either didn't pan out the way you guys had whiteboarded it, that now you've got actual people in the field actually using it. Like something had to not match up with what you were expecting that you learned. Anything come to mind on that?
There was something that we had planned for, but we had kind of underestimated its impact. And that's, as I'm sure you're familiar, kind of this whole, I suppose you'd call it latency, where guy gets out in the field, you've built them a mobile application, right? You put all this work into it, and you realize that there's some place that has terrible cell phone service. And so
Are
you've
you
done all this
saying that the
work,
carriers are you saying the carriers don't have ubiquitous coverage everywhere all the time? Because their maps all show that they do.
that's what the map says, but the map is not the territory.
It is not. So how did that play out? So let's. I know it probably seems strange. I want to go deep on this, but I think this is exactly the kind of area that catches people by surprise. And I'm partly joking when I talk about the carrier maps, but we all know it's true. We see the ads on TV. They show us these maps that look like everything's red, everything's fuchsia, whatever color that is, magenta.
Yes.
All the colors are all filled in. But then we have in the real world, we get out into the field and we find out that it's not that we don't have coverage, but maybe just like you said, you've got latency. So how did this actually play out? What was the feedback that you got? How was it impacting the users? Tell me a little bit more about that story.
Well, we had a field service technician servicing a Home Depot location that was kind of in the middle of nowhere. I mean, compared to, say the density that you have out here on the East Coast, right? So as soon as we got that complaint, I'm trying to remember if it came in as like an email or a phone call or whatever, but, immediately it was like, okay, if it happened there, it can happen other places. And so, we initiated a discussion with our technical team to make sure that we could store that data until they got back in, range of a tower. But, that fortunately we had built that kind of communicative relationship with the field from the beginning. So, they notified us almost right away.
And was there any change in the user experience for the field level folks that were using that application? Did they need to understand anything about how their data was being stored if they were in an area where there was poor connectivity, maybe even inside the building? Like it may have worked in the parking lot, but not inside the building super well. Were there issues that had to be addressed from a communication and training standpoint to say, this is how you are going to now have to interact with this technology, or was it behind the scenes?
Yeah, it was a communication as well, right? We had to, schedule a meeting with as many people as we could, get on the call. And it actually was a number of meetings, right? Because often these guys aren't available.
Yes.
They're living out of a truck, like, okay, when are they usually in the office? Well, Friday morning or, whatever that was. And so we tried schedule multiple communications as well as record them. And then you're going to push those recordings out. And, you have these conversations about, okay, so how long does it really take to implement change sometimes? And I've heard people on the podcast say, oh, we have a 30, 60, 90-day plan. The reality is, right, for some of these applications, it might be 12 months later that you're still doing some debug. I think maybe 10 of the dealerships, got it right away. That's just who they were, right? We had maybe 80% that, over the course of 3, 4, 5, 6 months, 8 months, whatever, they figured it out, right? It took them a bit. Maybe it wasn't their focus, but eventually they got it. And then we had 10%. Who are those guys in high school that just never really seem to be paying attention?
That's probably what people said about
me. Not to run
me.
Anybody down. Yeah.
I might have been in that 10% that you're talking about, but I know
might have been in the 10%. Yeah. No.
It's like
Yeah.
a bell
So
curve though, right? You got
yeah, it
10%
is.
early adopters, you've got the 80% in the middle, you've got the 10% on the back end that are either resistant or just struggling, or maybe there's some turmoil going on in their business. And this is just one more curveball that you're throwing
Yes.
their way at a time that wasn't optimal for
Yeah.
them, right? We'll give them the
Yeah.
benefit of the doubt. So this is another interesting thing to think about then. So what you learn from that first dealership, this is in the early stage in the kind of the pilot phase, I imagine, before you go out wide. What did you do then to recalibrate how you then brought the solution to the next market? How did that, or the next dealer, or whatever your kind of wave segmentation was, how did you change the communication going forward? Did you go back and update the materials and the go live plan for each of those locations based on the learnings that you had from the first site or two?
The first site, we didn't have any trouble, which in
Okay.
some ways is terrible, right? I
Interesting.
mean, the
Yes,
first
it is
site
terrible.
went well, and it's like, this is
Yes.
great. I'm
Yeah.
brilliant, right?
False positive.
Yeah, false positive. I'm
Yeah.
brilliant. I must be. My future's so
Man, I'm
bright.
good. Yeah.
Man, I'm good. Yeah. And then spread it wider, and then you get all these different bugs. Of varying sizes. You know, yeah, because each Home Depot store was a little different, and so where they did their check-in and like how are they swiping or whatever. Sometimes it was an issue with the physical equipment. So it was very much this incremental kind of grindy follow-up to identify all those things and resolve them. So it was very much on a weekly basis, a daily and a weekly basis, finding things, addressing them, and then telling people about the fix. So that issue with the latency didn't show up, because we were in Houston, and so Houston's fairly dense, right? Yeah, and this location was in I don't remember, like Utah or something. So we just hadn't. I had not anticipated that potential issue.
Yeah. Yeah, it's fascinating. I think this is just the real world, right? This isn't a problem, or at least as big of a problem if you have one or two locations and a couple dozen people. But when you start to scale projects up and you have hundreds or thousands of people and dozens or hundreds of locations, this variability starts to just catch up. And it seems to me that it snowballs. And so that scale
Yes.
doesn't make it more complicated on a linear graph. It's exponential, because just as the number of locations, the number of variables, carriers are stronger in different markets. Right? We talked about connectivity. The way that stores are built in certain markets are different than in other markets, right? So their technology infrastructure is different in each place. Like there's just so many variables that start to grow, and they don't just multiply, they really compound, and it becomes an exponential set of variables that becomes very difficult. And I think going back to what we talked about at the top of the conversation, the sooner we can begin to prepare the folks for the change and what they should expect to see, the more comfortable we can get them with a greater number of the things that are predictable. Here's what the workflows are going to be like. Here's what the software is going to look like. Here are the things that are going to be knowingly different than what you did before. So we can start to like compress the number of changes, so that then when we get out in the field and we do experience latency because of connectivity or other things like that, we're dealing with a fewer number of variables that we can now go tackle on a one-to-one basis, instead of this like mountain of challenge, because we're expecting these people to take a lot of change all at one time. And you actually have an operational background. So in addition to being a change management leader, how do you think that your operational background plays into how you think about supporting the men and women on the front lines?
I have a specific philosophy that I've kind of taken, for change. And literally, I just had this conversation earlier today, talking to someone at NYU on a different project. But suppose that you say that you really want a hybrid car, but you've been driving, say, the same minivan or whatever the last 6 months, and you're your 4 kids really like that, but you say, man, we really need a hybrid. And so the first thing you're thinking is, well, we should sell what we have and get something completely new. Uh, an alternative that a lot of people don't think of is there are hybrid kits. So you could buy a hybrid kit and you could retrofit what you have.
That's interesting.
And so you get what you want, and the kids are still riding in the same van that they have grown to love. Your spouse has the same sight lines that they're used to, the same method of parking, navigating the neighborhood, you know. So I think really hard about transformation, and that often there's only 4 or 5 really big levers that are going to make a transformation successful. And a lot of the other stuff is just bells and whistles. So if you can change as many of those things as possible, those 4 or 5, and then at the same time leave everything else the same, then your change management becomes much easier. Because, depending on, where they are in the process, their life might not change at all, even though the organization has been transformed. I had a role where I put in like a global trade management / manufacturing execution system that essentially would handle orders all the way from receipt of the contract through the processing yards, all the way to the shipping terminal. And then we could even track their movement on the water. So, the goal was to improve, order to cash. And I remember the guys in operations that were in the yards, they said, well, usually we track all our orders with an Excel spreadsheet. The truth was some of them were using carbon paper, but we'll leave that. We'll leave that alone. So they said, well, what's going to happen to my Excel spreadsheet? And I said, what's going to happen is we're going to give you a different Excel spreadsheet. That's it. Everything else, 95% of it is going to be the same. We'll give you a cell phone application that when you finish loading a shipping container and you're going through an inspection, you can take photographs of all the material. It'll assign it to a contract, and then it'll upload it to the cloud. That's what's going to change. And I had the same conversation with senior management, with executives, because they're worried about their guys that are having to actually do the work. And they said, so what's going to change? And I said, well, they're using an Excel spreadsheet now. They're going to use a different Excel spreadsheet. And I must have had that same conversation 5, 10, 15 times. But part of why we selected that vendor is because their solution had many on-ramps. In other words, you could take that Excel spreadsheet and you could email it in to the platform, and it would suck in all the data.
Brilliant.
Right? So most people know email, right? We're talking, technology adoption. Most of us know email. Yeah. So that works. There were also XML interfaces for some of the other regions, which is not a new technology either. It could accept data through file transfer protocol, which I remember using a long time ago. And then you could also connect to the system through an application programming interface, which is kind of how typically big systems communicate with each other. So by having those on-ramps, by making sure that those on-ramps were available to the business, so rather than saying, hey, you guys were in the Stone Age using carbon paper, new sheriff is in town, everything's changing, you need to get your act together. Instead, give them a menu of options. Here's the different ways that you can be successful. We're going to take away your Excel spreadsheet. We're going to give you a new Excel spreadsheet, and then we're going to give you all these on-ramps. And of course, initially there was concern, but within a couple of weeks, they got used to the fact that this was going to work. Initially, of course, right? They hold on to their old Excel spreadsheet just in case. Yeah. To be frank, they probably did that for months.
Yeah.
The implementation at Mitsubishi Caterpillar, we were the ones that implemented the application, and we ran a parallel Excel spreadsheet for about a year. Why? Well, because, if the platform doesn't deliver on the promise, then we've got a really big problem.
Yep. I've learned something today. You're really making me think about how many of us talk about the initiatives that we're implementing. Many of us that are involved, I'll put myself in this category because you're making me think about some of my own communications, but we're excited. We are leading change. We're excited about the change. Many of us that are involved in this are pretty passionate. We may have been heads down on this for weeks, months, quarters, whatever, sometimes years on a particular change. And so we use phrases like digital transformation, which is a phrase that I mostly hate, but I find myself using it because it's become
it's accurate.
kind of like common vernacular
Yes.
in around
Yes.
enterprise change. But if you think about what we're saying when we say that, we are going to the field and saying, hey, everything is going to transform. It's like, and we're excited because we're saying, hey, we're
Yes.
bringing new good stuff to the business, and we're trying to get better outcomes, and we're trying to improve customer experience, and we're trying to improve operational efficiency. So we're going to do this big initiative, and we actually inflate it, not to be disingenuous about the size of the change, but we're excited about it. We're promoting it, right? And we almost probably promote it as maybe being bigger than we should. And what you just made me realize is that this doesn't sound nearly as impactful. But if we said, hey, everybody, guess what? We're going to do a digital tweak. We're not transforming. We're just tweaking a couple things here and there. If instead of actually making it feel bigger, if we could actually flip that around a little bit and say, how can we make this seem a little bit smaller? And actually, as I think about some projects that are on my mind right now, they're field service management implementations, for example. And probably something like 80% of the things that the people in the field did before are going to be the same things that they'll do after, right? I don't know what the percentage is, but it's probably something like 80-20.
It's probably high. It's probably high.
You're going to look at a customer list in the morning. You're going to look at the list view in the morning. You're going to have a list of parts that you choose to put on a work order. You're going to have to track your time and mileage to the site. Like all those same things are still going to happen. And so 80% of this isn't transformative. 80% of it is actually probably going to be the same. The form on the screen might look a little bit different. Maybe the sequence of events might be a little bit different, but it's really a tweak, not a transformation. And then we have this 20% that we're going to be doing different things with our warranty work than we've ever done before, because that's the real reason we're implementing this, is because we've done a crappy job of tracking warranty entitlements and stuff like that, whatever the reason is, right?
Yeah.
And so it's interesting. I think we should promote the concept of digital tweaking. Is that,
some
sound very good.
Some version of that, I think, is on the nose, because otherwise they're going, oh my God, Torrence joined a cult.
Yes.
That's what's going on here. Or he went off his meds if he's on meds.
Yes, exactly. And everything's going to change because there's when everything feels like it's going to change, then it's overwhelming. And I think as we talk about these programs, we're saying, hey, because like in this project that I was talking about, from my conversation yesterday, these guys have been in this process now for well over a year. So the people that are implementing the change are deep into this. This is big and transformative to them.
It is.
But at the end of the day, to the guys in the field, probably something like 80% of what they do will be very similar to the way they did it before.
Yeah, sometimes the low-key approach, is the best, because the more. So here's an assumption I make: is that most of the people we deal with are carrying more anxiety than what they let on. They're worried about their mortgage, their cars, their spouse. Little Jimmy is taking a little bit longer to talk than what we thought. Cat got the flu, and you're not sure if it's going to be terminal.
And
Well, they say this
sometimes all
because we
these
actually
things,
had to take our cat to the doctor recent, and cat's okay.
I'm
But
happy to hear that. But sometimes
yeah,
these things all happen like at the same week in the
they're
same
all
month.
happening at the same time. And then
Yeah.
Torrance waltzes into the room and says, doing this transformation, guys, everything's going to be different, you know? And then he offers me some Kool-Aid, which I refuse to drink. Right. So, sometimes it helps us to, look at the project as it stands and kind of what the objectives are, and ask just a really simple question, which is, how is this going to affect the team, right? So these different groups, right? So as an example, that global trade management platform, there was a group of people called the centralized container department, and they handled, all these export shipments for the United States. And it was something like 700 containers a month. So a lot of volume, right? 2/3 of that going to China. So lots of stress, lots of movement, etc. So just imagine if I had gone over there, talked to the director who was over that and said, "Hey, we should do a transformation and change everything," right? They're already staying there till 6 or 7 o'clock at night. They're coming in on weekends, and now you want to throw something new at them. The way that we approached that communication was, hey, we think that there's a way to simplify what you're doing. And right now you're here till 6, 7 o'clock at night. You guys are coming in Saturdays for like a half a day. We think we can get that down to where you can work 8 to 5. Right? Selling the dream. You can work 8 to 5. But that was the approach, because they were doing all of this manually. It was email, Excel spreadsheets, and we had a whole room of cabinets filled with folders. And this wasn't that long ago. We're talking 2018. So that was how they were managing the process. And so it shifts from, you're throwing this new thing at me, I hope you don't ruin my life, to maybe my stress will go down, at least at work, right? The cat still has the flu, interest rates are still going up, but maybe this will work. And, maybe a lot of times is enough. Hearing people in the business say, maybe this will work, right? They don't always have full faith, right? Because they're probably not going to be at as many meetings as we are. They haven't spent all this time talking to the different vendors about what's possible, etc. But if we can get them to that maybe point, then now they're kind of malleable, right? They'll join a call with the vendor. They'll join a demonstration. They're open to having discussions about mapping the process and how it works today, and what are the issues, right? Because the issues, a lot of times, we want to shut down that guy that complains all the time. He's a resistor.
Yeah.
How will you deal with resistance, right? Like, okay, this is getting kind of hardcore, right? Like they're hiding behind walls and throwing grenades. The reality is, probably they have anxiety. They have seen these types of initiatives fail. So, what are we doing to show them that this time it's different?
Yeah. I think that's really well said. And I think a big takeaway for me, even with my own internal communications, on my own team, I think there's a lesson to be learned here about just rethinking how we communicate. Because I think another thing about frontline workers, and I've talked about this probably 100 times on the podcast, is the time element. This always comes up when we're in the field or in training centers like I was this week. The time that is not afforded to the people on the front lines during their time of change is a source of additional stress and frustration for them.
Yes.
So if they're expected to do 10 deliveries a day or close 5 tickets a day on a service call or whatever the case may be, like we tend to not give them enough time for those things already. And now we're saying, hey, you need to absorb this transformative digital project that we have. And so I
Yes.
think it would serve us and them better if we can really help them calibrate to say, hey, listen, we know that you have limited time. So actually what this is it's a change to 5, 10, 15, 20%, and maybe even dole that out over time so that we're not asking them to turn 180
Yes.
degrees right out of the gate, but
Yes.
begin to build a plan of evolution. And I love your idea of the phrasing and the concept of just saying, hey, you're doing it on spreadsheets before, you're going to do it on spreadsheets now. We're going to change some of the processes downstream, whether it's
Yes.
actually a spreadsheet or just the way you fill out data, on an inspection today versus the way you do it tomorrow. We're going to do the same QC steps that you did before. We're just going to have you document it a little bit differently, right?
Yes.
So instead of saying, hey, we're changing the QC process,
Yeah.
we're saying, no. The QC process is actually the same, but we're just going to document it in this new piece of software now. That's a literal example from something that came up earlier in this week.
Yes.
And so we can position it. There's a few different ways we can position it. One might be paralyzing. One might seem like, okay, well, that's fine because all the other stuff that I'm already doing is going to stay the same. And it's just this one change to this little piece. I think that's pretty good advice to share with others.
Well, and then another part of that you can even apply within the project team itself is, once again, they have lots of anxiety, right? They don't want to fail. And so you're proposing that they be responsible for some part of this new thing. And, a lot of times I'll just say things like, well, you know what? Let's just try it out. Let's try it out and see if it works. And if it doesn't work, then we'll try something else. So the goal then is to move as quickly as possible, because I think many times our creative mind works against us. And so as the project drags out, the anxiety goes up, as you alluded to, like literally right at the beginning of our conversation, right? Like, what's going on? Is management, planning some initiative they haven't told us about? Is this secretly doing something else, etc.? So, even within the project team, the faster it moves, the less anxiety they have, the less chances they have to have anxiety. And so, it actually pays off to joke a little bit and then to, ask for decisions in the meeting. So you want to be polite. You're not being quote unquote confrontational per se, but you're asking for a decision. And then if they say, well, I've got concerns, then the response is good. That's good, because that's what you want. Same thing in dealing with the guys in the field. Hey, here's what we're thinking of doing. And if you're lucky, they trust you enough to tell you that's stupid.
Yes.
That will never work. That will never work. I mean, that's like a sign of trust that they're willing to be that honest with you. So if you can get that, then the question is, well, okay, why? And, you want to document all those things. And then, the conversation continues to drill into those to figure out, which ones are maybe an issue that occurred in a past implementation, but it no longer matters. Or maybe it's something major that you over.
Be remiss to not plug my own platform right now, because we can actually support something that you just said. And this is actually not something that we have promoted in the past, but we are starting to do so. And so it's skillful. What we do is we simulate the workflows in software, primarily for the purposes of training. But there's also an opportunity for us to use it, same functions, no difference, just how we apply the tools that we already have to soliciting feedback before things have gone live.
Yes.
So imagine a scenario if we're going to be launching 20 new workflows to the field service team, and months ahead of go live, we don't have all of those workflows built in Salesforce or SAP or whatever platform we're implementing, but we have 5 or 10 of them. What if we started letting the team have exposure to those new workflows in a simulation? They can't break anything. They can't do anything wrong. You can't mess anything up in the system. There's no data, right? It's just a simulation. That's what our platform does. But if we wait until the end, then all we're doing is we're giving them a better tool at the last minute, and we're still expecting them to drink from a fire hose. If we use it instead many months before go live, and we start soliciting feedback through those simulations, they get to go in there and say, no, that's easy. That's going to be just fine. Okay. So now the product team can just say, okay, great. That one's done. Well, you mean this warranty thing, when they come back and have complaints about that, well, it's good that we caught that before we did the build and before we went live with this thing, because now we can capture some of that feedback earlier on. So listen, I lead a company that has a platform that does these things. Whether you use Skillful or whether you do this in some other fashion, I think there's a practice here that is underutilized that to me would be some low-hanging fruit to go out and get some feedback. But also what you're doing when you do that is you're introducing them to the change very far ahead of when they'll actually have to do this in the real world, in their job. And I think just, this has become a theme of our conversation today, Torrence. It'll just reduce the unknowns, which therefore reduces the anxiety, the fear of the unknown.
Yes.
And now they're going to look at these workflows and say, oh, that's actually not that different from before. Just the UI changed a little bit, but it's the same QC process. It's the same process. Okay. Yes, I've told that team that they should fix this thing. Great. That was good feedback. But most of it is just not that different. And I think we can do a lot of good there to bring them into the process. All the reasons we always talk about that. But I think we bring them into the process, or I think when that recommendation is made, we talk about bringing them in often in like the whiteboarding process, like trying to understand the current state. And I think there's an opportunity to bring them more into now the future state and get their feedback along that journey. And I think it serves so many purposes that would be crazy not to do that. So again, whether you use Skillful or whether you do this in some other fashion, I'd encourage people to start doing that as part of that change program. And it needs to not be in the days and weeks leading up. You need to do this far enough in advance that if you learn something insightful from the field, you have time as the product team to then go and change this, right? So that because now if you have information that shows that something's not going to work well in the field, the worst thing that you can do is find that out too late to make change. So the sooner you can learn those insights, the sooner you can get them implemented. And then by the time you go live, you're going to give them a better experience.
Yeah. And I think you can be strategic with it. We had, field service technicians who had, more respect amongst the other field service technicians because of their skill and their tenure. And so involving those people in the process gave the project a lot of credibility, because then, they can report out, hey guys, here's what we found. Separate implementation when I was, in the recycling business, and we had one of our supervisors involved heavily in the process and deciding what the future was going to look like. And, that person was able to accurately explain what the impact would be on the future with our proposed changes. So those people become, I don't know what you want to call it. I've heard change agents. I've heard mavens. Suppose I should come up with my own term.
Yes, you should.
And sell it. But I think of it as like a minimum viable process, in that you want to make sure that that process works. And if you can get to the point where it works, then the energy level and the amount of support, I think, goes way up. Because, waiting until the very end and doing a kind of big bang go live is very risky, because essentially you're asking for a vote of yes or no. Are you in favor or against? And you're doing it without ever priming the audience. Yeah. In a perfect world, you had discussions with them in the beginning, and some of the reasons for the changes are because of inputs that you got from them. And so, that momentum is ideally moving forward kind of from the beginning. And so they're following along with all the various twists and turns as things go well or go badly. And when you get to the end, they're really excited. They have ownership. We talk a lot about alignment in business. And I think, sometimes by alignment, we mean, are they going to do what I told them to?
Yes, that's what we mean.
That's what we mean. Are we aligned? Or are you going to have to get a different job?
Right.
Right? Which is okay. That's an approach, but there's also consensus,
Mm-hmm.
And so are you getting compliance or are you getting commitment so that 4 months from now, when you've moved on to the next project or that cat that had the flu, things have taken a bad turn, you're going to have to be home for a week, to hand feed them or something. Things don't fall apart just because you're not there to play police officer. It's going to carry forward on its own momentum, and I think that is how you can then have, a number of major initiatives, within, a year, 2 years, 3 years is it's like a kite. It's got enough momentum. You've got it up off the ground. It's high enough. It's going to stay in the air. Yeah. So, do you have compliance or do you have commitment? And if you say, well, I don't know what that is, Torrance, but we're aligned and they're going to do what I say, then things are going to get kind of dicey when you've got 4 or 5 of these things going at the same time.
Torrance, we got to wrap it up. I feel like there was so much more that I wanted to be able to cover. Before we close this thing out, is there one piece of advice you were hoping to offer today that I didn't ask the right question to pull it out from you?
Well, so who would the advice be aimed at?
That's up to you, but I think most of the listeners would be, the people are doing similar roles as what you're doing. They're operations leaders, they're change leaders, they're IT project teams that are implementing technology. So the frontline workers themselves probably aren't listening to our podcast, but people who are making decisions that are impacting them are listening today.
Sure. I do have a piece of advice, and it's going to be counterintuitive, especially for people who work a lot with technology. And I work a lot with technology, as do you. And a challenge we have is being constantly interrupted, inundated with information. And then if you use AI, which I use AI, now you have this whole other fire hose of data coming at you. And so people say, well, I've got like certain times when I don't use my cell phone and etc. Right? But one of the simplest things that you can do is go buy a notebook. They got like a 5x8 notebook that they sell at, pretty much any place that's a retailer. And you could put your schedule in there, your to-do lists, your meeting notes. And for people who also spend their time in the field, you're not going to be able to take your laptop out there. And if you keeping notes in your phone, now it just looks like you're distracted.
Mm-hmm.
So if you've got your notebook with you and you can index them it's a little bit of work to index it, but you've got all your conversations there. You've got all your history. You can write notes to yourself about, if things go well or things go badly. I literally have notebooks going back 12 years. It's a habit I've kept that long. And, the great thing is, like, they haven't figured out yet how to send email to paper.
Yeah, from that notebook.
Yeah, from that notebook. Yeah. So you're able to concentrate, and I think for people, like you and I, and to be frank, many of our technicians really are knowledge workers.
Yes.
We were paying technicians $50 an hour, and we were having trouble keeping them because other companies were willing to pay even more to get that same guy or woman with their technical knowledge. So, how do you get them to where they are not distracted? Well, you could give them a notebook. They'll write down in there whatever they want to write down in there. But there's so much that we think of or get inspired by that we never take the time to write down. And if we did that, I think
I think you're right. That is counterintuitive, but probably good advice. I know I'm guilty of being connected seemingly 24/7, and I could probably use a break every once in a while. So it might be hard to pull my smartphone and tablet out of my hands.
You know what? I do both, right? I got a smartphone. I've got, I don't even know what other gadgets, the
Yeah.
laptop, the iPad, my ebook. I mean,
Yep.
yeah. So
No.
I'm lecturing myself as much as I'm talking to anybody else.
Well, I think we're in this era right now where we are inundated with technology, and it's interesting because we're here, on a podcast that talks about technology adoption, and so we're actually trying to drive more adoption in some ways. But I think it's fair to talk about, we are still humans at the end of the day. We were not, we didn't evolve originally to use technology natively, right? There are a lot of things that we're doing today that we, our minds and bodies probably weren't really optimized for. So we certainly have to consider that. And I think when we talk about all the change that we're talking about on this podcast and in our work outside the podcast, it's certainly something to think about. And especially for the technicians and, product delivery folks that have so much other stuff to consume in order to do their job, we do need to look for ways to, give all of our brains a break. So, Torrence, I appreciate that last bit of advice. Yeah, I always feel like we could have gone on this route for 2 hours. So lots to share. Look forward to staying in touch with you, and I hope our paths cross again outside the podcast.
Thanks for listening to Frontline Innovators. If you enjoyed today's conversation, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And remember, when we put people at the center of digital transformation, frontline workers thrive and organizations succeed. This podcast is brought to you by Skillful, helping frontline teams adopt the technology they need to work smarter, safer, and with confidence.